In this video, we're going to cover the basics of game theory. So we're going to use these different kinds of games these different setups to talk about competition in an oligopoly. And we're going to take, of course, the simplest case we can, which would be a duopoly, which is when you have two companies. Some of you out there may be familiar with game theory. For some of you, you've maybe just heard the term, but have never really looked at it in any detail before. So let's just first start off by going over what are the basic pieces of a game, right? And in some sense, it might sound a lot like games that you play, like board games, right? So you have, first off, players, right? You need to know who the players are, how many players you have. And for all the examples that we're going to do, we're going to do one here, and then we're going to talk about sequential games in another video for a second example. We're going to have two players. And as you can see from the setup here, we have Apple and then Spotify. And we're going to be looking at two firms competing in the streaming music space. So we have to know who the players are. We have to know what their possible actions or choices are. So what can the players do? We have to have a set of rules. And commonly in different kinds of games, in our game theory, kind of our models, those rules are things like, well, do the players move simultaneously, as we're going to have in this first example? Do they move sequentially? So does one player get to move first, and then the second player reacts, as we're going to have in the sequential game example? Do they play the game more than once? Okay, so is it a one-off game or is it a repeated game? And we also need to know what the outcomes, or what we often refer to it as the payoffs. Right? So you think of the payoffs are the outcomes. So after we play the game, what's the end result? And so these are all of the things we need to define as we're setting up our game. So here's a basic game. Two players, Apple and Spotify. And we're making the assumption here that these are the only two providers of streaming music services, right? Just again, to keep it simple. You could always expand this to have a third player, but it's going to get a lot more complicated. So those are the players, right? Apple, Spotify. What are the actions or choices? So in this case, we're distilling this game down to they just have to decide how much they're going to set their monthly service fee at. Okay? And so we're giving them two choices. They're going to charge $9.99 or $14.99. And we're going to have the same setup for Spotify. Helps a lot of times if we just make these games symmetric. And you'll see that in the payoffs as well. Okay? So Apple is choosing between these two prices, and then Spotify is also choosing between these two prices. Okay? So in terms of the rules, they're both going to move simultaneously. Okay? So no one gets to move first. There's no advantage so no one's getting any kind of advantage here. It's not a model where you have an incumbent and a potential entrant. Okay? They're both here, and they're just going to decide what to set their pricing at, and they have to move at the same time. The payoffs are given in the different cells. So the way you should read this is in this upper left-hand cell. These are the payoffs when Apple sets its price at $14.99, and Spotify also sets its price at $14.99. The upper half of this cell gives you the payoff to Apple. So Apple will get $10 million. Spotify will get $10 million in profits as well. Come over here to this cell. So this is the case where Spotify charges $14.99 and Apple charges $9.99. In this case, Apple's profits are going to be $15 million and Spotify's will be $5 million. So why might that happen? Well, in this case, by charging a lower price, Apple is able to steal a lot of customers away from Spotify. So even though they're having a lower price, the way we're setting this up, underlying assumption here is that they're taking so many customers away from Spotify that they end up with higher profits. Okay? And you notice there's a symmetry here. In this case, in this lower left cell, this is where Spotify charges $9.99, while Apple charges $14.99. So in that case, Spotify gets the bigger profits of $15 million, while Apple's down at $5 million. And in this case, this is where they both charge the lower price, and they have profits of $7.5 million each. So now what we're looking for is we're looking for an equilibrium, right? The outcome. And we actually refer to this as the Nash equilibrium. Okay. Named after one of the founders of game theory. So how do we find a Nash equilibrium, or whether there even is a Nash equilibrium? It's possible some games don't have one. So here what we do is we are looking for what we call best responses. Okay, so this is how you go about solving these games. You're looking for, in every scenario for a player, what is their best response. So this is how we do this. Let's take Spotify. We want to know what is Spotify's best response to Apple choosing a price of $14.99. Okay, so we're saying let's assume Apple was charging this higher price of $14.99, so we know we're working with the left-hand column in our payoff matrix. All right, so now we're down to these two. Well, so now what is Spotify doing? They're choosing between setting the same price of $14.99 and getting profits of $10 million, or setting the lower price and getting higher profits of $15 million. Well, in this case, clearly, right, 15 is better than $10 million, so their best response to Apple charging $14.99 would be to charge $9.99, right? So we know this is what they would do. So this is if you knew this is what Apple was going to charge. Now, if Apple were to charge $9.99, what should Spotify do? Well, if they charge the higher price of $14.99, their profits would only be $5 million, whereas if they also charge the lower price of $9.99, their profits would be $7.5 million. So again, Spotify would be better off charging the lower price. So what have we found here? We found that no matter what Apple does, Spotify always wants to charge $9.99. So in this case, we say that Spotify has a dominant strategy. Okay. So a dominant strategy is one where that player always wants to make that move or that play regardless of what the other player does. So as we've just shown, Spotify always wants to charge the lower price, so it has a dominant strategy. Now let's turn our attention to Apple. So when we're looking at Apple, remember we're looking at the upper half of each cell to see their payoffs. So if Spotify charges $14.99, so we're working with the top row, what does Apple want to do? Well, if they also charge $14.99, their profits will be $10 million. If they charge the lower price, their profits will be $15 million. So, just as it was for Spotify, Apple would rather charge $9.99. Likewise, if Spotify charges $9.99, Apple again is better off charging $9.99 as well and getting the 7.5 rather than the $5 million in profits. Which means that Apple also has a dominant strategy. Right? In these kinds of games where both players have a dominant strategy, it's really easy to see what your Nash equilibrium is. In this case, it's right here. Right? Because in this case, right, Spotify's best response lines up with Apple's best response. Right? Neither firm has any incentive to move away from this outcome. Right? So if we're here, in this case where they're both charging $9.99, and making $7.5 million in profits, right? Spotify won't just all of a sudden switch and charge $14.99, right? Because they'd be losing $2.5 million in profits. Okay. Likewise, Apple's not going to switch, right? In this case, moving from this column to this one, they're not going to switch to charging the higher price because they would also see a drop in their profits. So this is a stable equilibrium. When you're here, neither player has an incentive to deviate from this. Of course, if you look at the payoffs, it's not the best that the firms could do. Right? The best outcome, from a mutual standpoint, would be if they could somehow get up here to where they're both charging the higher price. Right? They would love to be here and making $10 million in profits each. But that's not a stable equilibrium if we're just doing this as a one-off game. right? Because if you started off up here, each firm, Apple and Spotify, both have the incentive to drop their price and try to steal market share and bolster their profits. So how could they do this? Well, firms might have some incentive to try to do this by colluding, which of course is illegal. And that's why we have laws against collusion in the United States. Other countries do as well, is because you can see this is not beneficial to the consumer, right? They'd be both charging, right, the higher price, so it would hurt the consumer, so we don't allow firms to collude. Right? But that is one way, right, that otherwise they, in a non-cooperative game, they can't get to that better outcome. Right? So this is just kind of the basics of game theory. In the next video, we're going to take a look at a slightly different setup where we have a sequential game.